Okay, so how does a historian talk about aircraft carriers in science fiction? Well, there's actually some good things to start off with. For starters, there are some similarities going across here. There are things you expect, and there are things you expect to find. And one of the purposes this video is going to look at is going to provide a definition, and I'm going to explain that definition. And it's going to provide some sort of baseline idea for how we compare and contrast carriers in science fiction and how we can use that information. Because there is stuff to be able to be learned. You see, a lot of what we have today was science fiction if you look far enough back. If we go through history, some of the concepts of what we're living today are literally science fiction to the people in the past. And so it's always important to look at these things, because they can give you an idea of what's going to come, what kind of troubles and problems you might face, and what you might need to overcome. And so it gives you a time to prepare for it in a way. But saying that, I'm not going to keep this going for this introduction going for long. I'm going to get into it as quickly as I can. Travels, Battles, and Airings. Now, this is my shameless book plug, and I do this at the beginning of every video, mainly because, well, I'm an academic, so we are promoted based on our book sales. We are hired by universities based on how well our books do, how well our journal articles do. So, in the nicest way, I'm not going to not encourage my book to be procured. And there are other books coming soon, hopefully. But also, this channel. Without your support, without people liking, sharing the videos, without people watching through and seeing the adverts, etc., it wouldn't sustain itself. It wouldn't keep itself going. I have, as most historians do, a very expensive book habit. If it wasn't for your support, your kindness, on Patreon, on Ko-fi, on being members of the channel, all those things, I wouldn't be able to keep up with the books which, not just I need the ones I get from my research, but the ones I get because I enjoy reading them and allow me to do more topics on this channel. Because, yeah, there's the areas which I go and personally research in archives myself and spend time doing, but there's also areas where I buy all the books which have been produced on the subject so I can talk it through. If I give you an example, I've got one here. Hirohito's Samurai. Now, this book is a really excellent guide to the people who commanded and led the Japanese in World War II. But I don't have necessarily the linguistic skills, or the time, or money to go off and do the research myself to produce that book. So buying that book, however much it costs, is useful for me. For actually some of my own work, but also for doing a lot of videos on this channel where I discuss the Japanese, because it allows me to quickly go through and find their officers and follow their careers and work out what their experience and where they're coming from when they're making decisions. So, yeah, thank you. Without your support, none of this would be possible. So let's establish a baseline, as what fills the definition today might not tomorrow. And a good example of this is the Falklands War as a sort of breakpoint, because quite a lot of the time when we're talking today about point defense or area defense missiles, people look at their ranges and go, well, this must be an area defense missile now. This is an area defense missile because it's got this range. And you go, well, it does have the same range as the old area defense missiles did, but it's not fulfilling that role. It's not that purpose. Yes, it's got a better range, and yes, there are options which are growing. One of the joys and complications of this is that quite a lot of missile systems have various variants, and some of those variants are definitely in one category, some of them are in the other category, and some of them are transitional ones in between, which go either way. A good example of this I often give is the Sea Viper. There is Aster 15, Aster 30, and all sorts of variations on Aster 30. At one point they were talking about Aster 45. They've had fun, but basically the trouble is Aster 15 is theoretically a point defense missile, and is mostly used as a point defense missile. However, it's the same unit, just without an extra booster as the Aster 30. Pretty much. And it's similar when we're sort of talking about Sea Scepter, which is sort of modern and has variants. There is the quad packed version, which is still very much a point defense missile. Yes, it has a range of 45 kilometers versus the conventional Sea Scepter, which has a range of roughly 25 kilometers. But an area defense missile we're looking at has a ranges of 120, 150, 200 kilometers plus. So it's sort of it's not quite. And then there is the MR variant, which has been developed to Polish requirements by Poland and Britain, but has a range of 100 kilometers. Now, that can only be dual packed. That can't be quad packed in a Mark 41 VLS. But it's got a range of 100 kilometers, so surely that's now an area defense missile. It's certainly edging in that direction. It is. But you can't then use that to say, well, Sea Scepter's an area defense missile, because there's still variants out there which are 25 kilometers range. There is a specific variant of Sea Scepter which is edging towards a shorter range area defense missile with 100 kilometers plus range. But it's still not really the same as a specifically designed area defense missile. And the fact is, these are 4.5 higher plus. This is Mach 3 plus. There is a difference going on here. And then if you go back to the ones in the Falklands War, you have the point defense missiles are Mach 0.8. There is Seawolf, which is Mach 3 plus, but their ranges are 5 kilometers, 6.5 kilometers. The VLS version of Seawolf took it up to 10 kilometers. But then we've got Sea Slug below that, which is an original generation, an OG, if you want to use that phrase, area defense missile. 32 kilometer range. If you're comparing Sea Scepter to that, then pretty much every variant of Sea Scepter is probably an area defense missile. But we don't. That's from 1965. That is, and I know this is going to be hard for some people to hear, very nearly 60 years ago. Technology's moved on. Things have changed. So what do we think about when we're talking about area defense missiles when we're talking about point defense missiles? Well, think about this. An area air defense missile is something which is for task group defense. Essentially even task force defense, where it might involve multiple task groups. You are able to defend a wide range and spread of forces. It's not quite theatre level, but it is definitely able to defend a wider range of naval forces spread around. Point defense. That's about being able to defend yourself and, to an extent, perhaps some of the task group, other members of the task group. But remember, ships are usually spread out quite far in a modern task group to avoid them being able to be taken out in a single hit by, let's say, a nuclear weapon or something like that. And the other point you have to remember is, if you're engaging something which is going at Mach, let's say 7, let's say it's borderline hypersonic. Well, if you hit that, and if you hit it hard at, let's say, 45 kilometers away, that means the weapon you're engaging, if it's going Mach 7, can cover roughly 48 kilometers in roughly 20 seconds. So 45 kilometers is less than 20 seconds. That doesn't give you much time for an engagement. Let's be honest, 150 kilometers plus isn't much of an improvement. It takes it up to a little bit over a minute of time to engage. You're going to want to spot them a lot further and queue up. But you're basically, if you want to engage that target, you've got a missile which is roughly moving at about 1,000 meters a second to engage the one which is moving at roughly 2,400 meters a second, a closing distance of 3,400 meters a second. Roughly. That's the point defense battle. So would you want to be engaging something which is going that fast at 6.5 kilometers away from you as your point defense weapon? No. And no, not all weapons are like that. Some are bombs which are have smarter pop-up systems, etc., and all sorts of scenarios. And yes, some of the missiles now, especially the point of defense missiles, are a lot smarter. They're able to do a lot more movement and a lot more engagement. But it's because the threat they're dealing with has got more complex, has got smarter. So they've had to get smarter, and their ranges have had to grow to give them more time to engage and intercept. Because it is better to engage and intercept the target away from the ship than it is to when it hits the ship's hull. When you're dealing in 1980s, you've got a 6.5 kilometer range. That's great. That's a very good range, a healthy engagement range. Nowadays, honestly, 25 kilometers is probably a bit short. And this has created a whole other problem for many navies in that their traditional close-in weapon system, let's say it's the Phalanx. Well, under those scenarios, the Phalanx's range is way, way too short. But try and explain that to governments. So, you need definitions, therefore, which aren't affected by these sorts of things. Aren't affected by, oh yes, it's going to be range. Because if the range is going to change and grow as the level of threats grow and as you have to evolve these things and improve them, then range boundaries are going to become more and more meaningless. And more just pointless to an extent. Because everything's going to be an area defense missile. Sea Slug, 32 kilometers. Sea Scepter, 25 kilometers. And so, when we move from that, we then have to look at the existing definition of an aircraft carrier. And there's a pretty good one from Admiral of Fleet Sir Caspar John, writing some point in probably the 1950s, 60s, but published in 1987, so that's when we're going to go with. And he writes, please consider the following. An RAF station operating 60 to 80 single or small twin-engined aircraft, and the fuel stores, firefighting equipment and so on to go with it. A couple of batteries of heavy anti-aircraft guns, ammunition and control gear, a minor battersea power station, a big radio transmitting and receiving station, the radar and communications and other ancillaries of an RAF fighter sector controller. Consider all the men, about 2,000, and accommodation wanted for these functions, then issue them all with 3 months' provisions. Now put the whole lot inside a metal box, 800 feet long by 90 feet wide, by about 90 feet high. Make the box self-propelled and operate aircraft from the top of the lid. There is your aircraft carrier. Now the problem is that definition, it's very encompassing, but it doesn't really work for a space carrier, does it? We want a definition that allows us to define things and define the capabilities we're looking at and looking for, which also doesn't tie necessarily to some of these points, because these points are very much a fleet carrier. A fleet carrier. A modern naval carrier. In fact, all naval carriers to an extent. Well, I came up with this. Definition for a carrier. A vessel which devotes a large proportion of its volume to the operation and recovery of Parsite Craft, which provide its primary means of both attack and defense. That, to me, defines a carrier. Now, some people, when I did this live, took umbrage with the large proportion of its volume. Well, no, its primary purpose has to be its aviation. And the idea of it being defense and attack, well, think about it from this perspective. If it's using missiles for its attack, and it's carrying a couple of squadrons for defense, that's not really a carrier, is it? That's a battleship or battle cruiser or something, which just has fighters on as an additional two, because its primary weapon system is its guns or its missiles or whatever it's using. It's not its Parsite Craft. And very much it has to be able to get into range of the enemy because it's going to be firing them from its range. Whereas something which is a carrier sits back beyond the enemy. Lynn Stewart has his book, Space Carrier Avalon. It's a good book. But the whole point of the aircraft, of the fighters, is they are supposed to be able to allow a carrier to stand back, in relative safety. And when they can't, that's a big problem. When they have to join the fight, that's a big problem. Sometimes they have to. Sometimes you need the firepower they have. Sometimes you need the capabilities they do have, because after all, they're spacecraft, and frankly, you can't rely... You know, there is always problems that could happen, so you have some weapons on your carrier. But as a rule, you don't want to risk that. And to an extent, carriers make a lot of sense for spacecraft. Parasite craft make a lot of sense, because in space, even more than at sea, and at sea it's always true that the best lifeboat you have, the best life preserver you have, the best asset you have for survival at sea, is the principal ship you're on. It's the big ship. Not the lifeboats, not anything like that. You want to keep the ship afloat. In space, your best chance of survival in space, which is not exactly a human-friendly environment, is going to be the big ship you're on. It's going to be the ship which supports the most crew, has the most facilities, has the most redundancy built into it, because it has the space to have the redundancy built into it, all those things. You don't want that to be damaged if you can avoid it. Now, maybe this means space warfare becomes something which people don't do. But the odds are, and this is of course judging by humans, who are my main example, but I would also say by, well, a highly militant corgi, that isn't necessarily the case. You know, I have two dogs. I have the senior fluffy research assistant, who's a poodle. Standard poodle, big one, likes to wear a cardigan. And I have the fluffy research assistant, used to be junior, and trainee, then junior, is now just fluffy research assistant. He's managed to go up promotions. It's good. It's good. There is chance of promotion in the university I run. It was a corgi. Now, he is a wonderful and lovely dog. He really is. Don't try and get between his food bowl and him when he's eating. He's every other time the nicest dog you'll ever see. Do not get anywhere near. Do not even joke about his food bowl. I have never done that because I'm not stupid. But I have had conversations with people, I won't say who thought he was eating too fast, so decided they were going to try and take his bowl away from him. No one was hurt. But the point is this. Wars start for 3 reasons. Avarice, fear, misunderstandings. That's what starts wars. Avarice is greed. Those are wars usually started by dictators. Fear. Fear starts more wars than we like to think about. Fear of what the other side might do to you because you feel weak. That starts a lot of wars. The preemptive strike, we better do this because otherwise when they are at full strength and come for us, we won't be able to stop them. Fear. Fear can infect your thinking. Fear can make you push you down a blind alley because you feel weak. And fear can send you to war. Good example of that is Japan in World War II. The third one. Miscommunication, misunderstanding. Again, it's something which has happened and is probably going to be more likely to happen as time goes on, because the more we get used to instantaneous communication and instantaneous answers, the more not having those answers are going to frustrate people and are going to lead to miscalculations. So I don't think war's unlikely in space. Sadly enough. Again, I'm going to go read some good books. Green Stewart's are going to be recommended a fair amount through this, and a few others are going to be recommended through this particular video. Now, the thing is, A carrier makes a lot of sense for a primary capital ship. Then you're still going to need a whole maelstrom of other ships as well. There are some interesting people who commented on the one live when it is who basically said, no, all the ships will be the same. Probably not. Because you're not going to want a ship which is the same size for all duties. Now, you might have a system whereby you can add on bits and make ships grow larger or smaller, etc. You know, take parts away. You know, they're fully modular warships. You might have that. But you're still not going to always send out a ship with all the modules you can put on it. Versus when you might need to send out a big ship, which will have all those modules. And you're probably going to have a range of ships. Is it going to be like we consider in modern task force structures, etc.? A load of smaller ships around a larger central capital ship operating in a task group. I have a strong suspicion that could be how it ends up, but I can understand why people make arguments based on efficiency and the realities of space operation why they don't believe that will be the case. I can understand and accept their logic. However, I have a strong feeling that humans have had a history of doing it this way and thinking about things this way, and to get them to think differently is going to require more than an argument based on logic and efficiency. And if you believe that isn't the case, have a look at any ongoing political debate and ask yourself, does the side which is arguing from logic and efficiency always win? In fact, do they ever win? There are good questions to ask. So my view is you are likely to get some form of capital ship assets, i.e. large vessels, and I think some of them will be carriers. And I think those ships in operation will try and stay as far back from the enemy formations as possible to provide and support their Parsite Craft, and those will be the ones going forward and carrying out the duties, and also acting as the primary defense, as well as offense of it. And again, you do that because where's it better to engage your threat that's trying to come attack you? Well, as far away from you as you possibly can. There was one person who, I think their comment actually didn't get through because they managed to wrap in swear words, and because of my video and my channel, as I've discussed on many videos, I have a lot of cousins, including a lot of little cousins who watch the channel. I'm outnumbered 40-1 girls to boys. There are boys younger below, and of course they have their spouses now as well, but that doesn't really add to my safety. And if their children pick up, the little cousins, okay, pick up any words and they can blame it on my channel, I will not live. So I operate a very strict swear word filter. I do not mind. You can disagree with me as much as you say. There was some person who recently sent all sorts of diatribes through, kept saying I was blocking them because they disagreed with me. And I ended up on a comment which they'd put, which was a less, which had got through the filter because it hadn't had those on, basically saying, I'm not blocking you. You're blocking yourself by swearing, and the swearing filter is stopping you. You are more than welcome to disagree with me. I'm happy for you to do so. They then deleted that comment, which I responded to. Hey ho. But that was the point. I don't block comments unless they're swear words or advertisements for all sorts of weird things. And also I don't do any competitions that I don't do it. If I've done a video about a competition, that's a competition I'm running. If there's anything pops up in the chat saying I've got a giveaway or contact me over this, please don't. The only contact me is Discord. That is the only contact me I run, and there's a Discord server. Links are in the descriptions below every single video. Anyway, let's go to the first and probably the most well-known now carrier, by definition, of science fiction, the Star Wars Venator. Now, I happen to love this. This is my favourite ship from Star Wars. It's also my biggest problem with a lot of the franchise, in that they put into a better ship And there was a better Star Destroyer in the Clone Wars than there was in the Empire, in the Imperial era. Caramba. But it makes sense to an extent because the Empire is regressive. The Empire is very much about centralized control. And carriers are about trust. They're about training. They're about a high level of professionalism. They're all about things which honestly do not fit well with dictatorships. They really don't fit well with dictatorships. And there are countries today in the world who are running into that problem. They are investing, they are trying to build the carrier programs, and they're realizing that the level of fluidity of thinking that's needed, the level of interoperation requires a level of trust which dictatorships as a rule are just not structured to entrust with people with. They just don't believe in that level of trust. And a level of reliance upon competency as the first requirement. Now, some are adjusting better than others. But for all nations, this is a thing when you're developing an aircraft carrier, when you're operating this sort of scenario carrier, it requires a significant level of trust. Because the senior officers, the very senior officers, are usually left back on the ship. They have to trust relatively junior officers to take off a huge amount of firepower in distributed assets, coordinate and cooperate together, and achieve a goal without being able to directly influence it. That is scary. That is scary unless you have absolute faith in those people doing that. Now, I loved the Venator. I have to say I did prefer the later Venators, which had their hangars exit through the sides, and they sort of started to work away the big central doors, because I always thought those were a very cool idea, but also a very problematic idea. I have this thing also add that myself, I would have not included those doors, and I've probably added some more of those principal batteries down a spine down the front, about another 4 down the front. That would have given them a lot more firepower, and you can then argue, well, hang on, is that giving it making them their primary weapon? No, that's not making a primary weapon, but that is a realization that especially during the early years, they would be bouncing into places and not know what they were going to find when they bounced into it. And that's about providing enough firepower to give you the time to launch your air group and disengage. That's what that firepower should be for. I always hated it whenever I saw Venators ending up in slogging matches and fighting with enemy starships, because that's just not what that ship's for. It is a ship entirely built around its air group. Let's be honest, they take up the huge proportion of the ship. They are built around this fighter group, these Parsite aircraft, these Parsite craft. It's supposed to be hanging back. It's supposed to have its firepower to buy it time to launch its Parsite craft, maybe to assist in certain scenarios where those Parsite craft need a bit of assistance. But principally, it's supposed to be just sitting back. And actually, that's the really strange thing, because the whole launching of aircraft and recovery, launch and recovery of the Parsite craft through that huge bay, that makes most sense from a ship which is supposed to keep as far back as possible. The fact that in the Star Wars scenario they can't keep as far back as possible leads against that. I have to say, I still don't believe it. I wouldn't take them full Lexington class of the US Navy. Mainly because I do not like the concept of 8-inch guns on my aircraft carrier. Because if my carrier is in a scenario where it's exchanging 8-inch gunfire or needing to exchange 8-inch gunfire with an enemy, there have been a lot of things which have gone wrong. And please note, when I'm talking about the guns on these ships, I believe they're there for when things go wrong. They shouldn't be a primary weapon system. Using them as such puts your ship in danger. There are other vessels for that role. There really are. Now, this, though, is a special case. I've done a whole video on the Andromeda, on the Glorious Heritage class cruiser. And I've gone through it extensively. And one of the things that always interests me is it does have a very good Parsite Craft mix. It does have drones. It has optionally crewed fighters. It has all sorts of options it can use. But the thing is, they're always secondary, tangential, additional to its primary weaponry, its primary purpose. It is a command cruiser. Did actually interest me though thinking it through, because whenever I go into the Andromeda universe and this particular scenario, and the task groups they used to form and the fleets they would talk about, and they had destroyers, which were basically missile ships, almost the same size, if not bigger, some of them, than the Glorious Heritage class cruiser, but literally were just there to pump out missiles. And they formed the bulk of the fleet. And the idea was they would stand off and use their missiles to engage from range, and then the Andromeda and other vessels would sort of the cruisers and sort of frigate-ish vessels would be the closer engagements, which would go and form the battle line to keep the enemy away from the destroyers. I have to say, I felt the universe was missing something, and it's kind of like similarly you've seen in some sort of versions of Star Trek, whereby their doctrine, their tactics are all calling for some kind of carrier, some kind of vessel orientated around its Parsite Craft to assist in those duties. Especially if you're defending. Think about it from the point of view: the destroyers are standing off and firing, lobbing missiles from very long range. Well, you already got those standing off. Why not a vessel which is standing off to send in waves of fighters, or the optionally crewed fighter craft, and to support the fight as well as to add an extra layer of defense for the destroyers? But no, it's an interesting scenario. Again, it's an interesting view on space, and it's got its own, of course, methodology of intergalactic and spatial travel, which perhaps has an impact on what's chosen. Perhaps. I can imagine maybe a carrier structure might be less suited to that methodology of movement, but honestly, I feel that would be a stretch. A big one as well. It's kind of like when people in Star Wars start giving me good and valid reasons for why the rebellion do not have the Venator, and I go, well, no, it's the best reason you can say is they didn't think, and the Imperials managed to get them all. But the fact is, getting a few Venators would have been an absolutely exceptional find for the rebellion, because that would have meant that instead of having to base themselves on planets which could be blown up by, I don't know, a giant thing called a Death Star. Admittedly, they didn't realise it was being built necessarily when they were putting their bases on there, but still, going to all the trouble and expense to defend those planets, they could have instead just launched their X-Wings and their very, very fast fighters, which are capable of jumping through hyperspace themselves, have them go launch their strike and launch them from one system, be waiting in another system to collect them after they've carried on their strike, and then go carry on to a third system while being maintained and fixed up to launch another strike again. You could wander around all the sectors. The problems for the for the Empire would have been magnified dramatically. Sorry. This is the trouble with having a set of Warhammer stuff in front of you while you're talking about empires. You keep wanting to say Imperium. They're different things, honestly. They're different. The Emperor and the Emperors are different people, They both have powers which we might associate with higher beings, but they're different. They both have religions based around them, but they're different. The Sith religion is not really based around the Emperor, although there do seem to be some cultists in later episodes and films who are worshipping like it is. So there's some interesting stuff going on. Anyway, the fact is, the Empire was even too far at getting rid of Venators for themselves, because they need to reinvent it. This is the Secutor, which is basically the Empire going, we need a bigger Venator. And that's pretty much what they've done. They've created a bigger, slightly better Venator. And then they've given it terrible, terrible Parsite Craft, because they have the TIE Fighters, which are a true expression of, we need these because we need the capabilities that this sort of system offers us, but we have no trust or faith in pilots under this scenario because they're out being individuals. So we want them to have the minimal assets possible, so if they become a problem, we can easily swap them out of the sky. It's literally what it is. Modern equivalents are if you are sending your pilots up in MiG-15 still. If you're doing that or anything like that, when you can probably afford to buy something a lot better, you're doing that because whilst you want the capabilities of air power, you want the ability to destroy it in a moment if you need to. The trouble was, and that's basically the whole problem with the TIE Fighter again, is that all these carriers, and there are a lot more than just the Secutors, there's also there's a couple which literally just look, which are just ships with hangar bays attached to them in the Star Wars universe. Is that, doesn't matter how many TIE Fighters you're really carrying. There are reasons for the TIEs to be as bad as they are. There are reasons for them. They are cheap, cheerful, and expendable. But that is the problem when you then say, right, and we're going to spend a lot of money training and getting an elite pilot force, which is what the Empire does. If you look at some of the manuals and works around TIE Fighter training, the pilots are exhaustively trained, really high quality training, and then they're put in the TIE, which has no survivability. It would be the equivalent of doing the modern level of training we do for a pilot today, and then sticking them in a Sopwith Camel. And telling it to go up against, I don't know, Eurofighters. I would say the F-22, but that's... they have no chance. Whereas, some of the TIEs do actually win against some of the X-Wings, so, a Sopwith Camel might get lucky versus a Eurofighter. There's a chance. I know it's not a very high one. Please, you do not have to comment below with how low a chance of probability of a Sopwith Camel getting lucky versus a Eurofighter Typhoon is. But there's a chance there. There's slightly more of one than versus an F-22. Not much more of one, but there is something more. Then we have the Daedalus class battlecruiser. Now, here's the thing. This class is actually quite interesting to really get into. Are they a carrier? Are they something else? Well, once they have the beam weapons fitted, as well as having the missile system, which they have from the original, you would be hard-pressed to claim that their Parsite Craft are their primary means of offence or defence. They are certainly their primary means of force extension and of force multiplication. But honestly, you would be expecting it to sort of double up on its pods. I don't know, mount how they have the hangars mounted low. As you can see, they're sort of hexagonal shapes. Have another shape above on the level above the sort of, so you have the two mounted, one above, the mounted one, two on each side above each, one above, sort of in one above the other scenario. And maybe you can make the case of them being a carrier, but they're not. They're battlecruiser. And like the Glorious Heritage class from earlier, I do have videos on this channel about them. There are videos, you can go and see an entire video discussing the Daedalus class. I'm not a geek, honestly, not a geek. Look, the thing is, these ships make sense. You've got uh, civilization and organization taking its first steps into building a space navy. They want something which is a flexible asset which they can deploy and can be one-stop shop for many situations, or which they can group together into a modular, sort of as a modular force structure. So all these ships are 70% solutions for any scenario, and okay, you send a couple of them, and that gives you the full range of capability. You send a couple of them along, you have enough Parasite Craft to spread out and fully monitor a planet or a system or something like that. You know, that is acceptable. That is an acceptable and sensible route for, let's be honest, Earth in the Stargate scenario is not a major power, they're a medium power. Their tech is pretty good, especially after they get upgrades from all the others, from some of the major powers, but they are not the largest power in their galaxy, in Milky Way, let alone the Pegasus galaxies. They're just not. But they have the capabilities. They really do. And I'll be talking about, I think the Wraith Hive ship is in here. Let me just check my whole thing. Yeah, the Wraith Hive ship is in here. So that is far more of a carrier in its purpose. Far more of a carrier in its operation. Because again, the Wraith build a far more traditionally structured formation. What I found interesting was the choice of battle cruiser as the terminology for the Daedalus class. And that to me really did fit with them. And the reason I would have for that is they are built to be used for the cruiser for the presence mission, but they're also the battle line for Earth. So they do both roles. And it's kind of saying, look, yes, we are building them for the cruiser role, but they have to be slightly more than a cruiser role. If you were building something which is a pure cruiser, there are other ships in the scenario which they could have picked, and honestly something that large, that capable, probably wouldn't have got through. The moment you give it the title Battle Cruiser, it fits. There were suggestions you could call them Battle Carrier, but I don't think so. Maybe if it had the four hangar pods, that might work, but yeah. And again, all these scenarios, you're having spaces in your ship which are going to... You're having to control the access and the entrance and exit of potentially space, vacuum, and losing stuff to the vacuum of space. And it requires the amount of various technologies. It's, again, one of the interesting things you can have a discussion with people is they start sort of going, no, this technology won't work and this technology won't work. And you go, alright, so how are you going to do it? Well, no, you don't want to have any holes in your spaceship. You're going to need to have holes. You're going to need to get in and out. And there are going to be other holes for other reasons. Maintenance alone. So there's going to be holes. Yes, the scale of it is sometimes interesting. But there are holes in the bottoms of most ships that let in water and let out water. There's things like if you need cold water brought in for the condenser plant, you'll often have the system which picks up the cold water will be mounted further back of the hull, then the water will run through and then it'll expel actually further forward from when the hole comes in. And you have these things. You have these things because you need the water. You need to do it. And that's in a ship which, if water comes in, it sinks. You still have to have them because it's an engineering consideration. And we have moon pools and all sorts of things we've developed for deployment of Parasite Craft from ships. And again, this is a point at which things start to get interesting. When you're talking about spacecraft, should you be drawing from aircraft or from ships in terms of terminology? And honestly, it's going to be a bit of a fusion of the two. And there is, again, usually a discussion of whether submarines are more appropriate than surface ships. And again, in terms of operating the vessel, it's going to be operating more like a submarine, thinking those dimensions. But in terms of the range of weaponry and systems you're going to be able to deploy, that's far greater than you can from a submarine. Especially today. You're going to have a far greater range of weaponry you can deploy from a spaceship than you can from a submarine. So principally because of the way the submarine operates and how the submarine operates versus operating in space. And that's going to require a further level of thinking. The reality is that there is no scenario on Earth which is a perfect path straight into thinking about space combat. All things can feed in a little way. A little bit of information, a little bit here, a little bit there. And that's why how you have to draw it and how to have to think about it. All of these things are going to feed into it. There is nothing which is going to be exact. Oh, we're going to take this, and that's going to exactly transpose to that. Just not going to happen. Now, the Castle Federation series, that's where actually Space Carrier Avalon is from, which that's the first in the series. And honestly, the entire scenario is built around how big can you build ships? Pretty much because of the way their systems work and the materials needed for their fast night travel. It benefits you building the largest possible ships. That's the way it works. Again, it's a very good, interesting system, and there's a lot of core logic used around. That's one of the reasons I am using Glyn's book so much. I will admit here, Glyn is a personal friend. As well as being an excellent science fiction author, he is a personal friend. When we did the Shipshape crew visit to Canada, before Shipshape badge existed, but, you know, it was the same four of us who went to Canada to see HMCS Haida, to see all the ships out there. We basically kidnapped him for a few days, and he came along with us, and he's come over to UK and gone around things with us. He is a wonderful author. There are other people's books going to be in here, but the thing is, I use his carrier books and a lot of his books in parts of my teaching when I want to give students an example, because I lecture in war studies, military history, international conflict, and sometimes some areas of conventional deterrence and how to manage conflict, and how to manage wars, etc. And it's easier sometimes when you're teaching theory and you're going through the things to give people an example which is from science fiction, which no one should have any how do I put this? Any significant emotional connection to. So you can basically go, well, this is this side, let's analyze it. And no one's going to be blinded by going to have an emotional connection for first testing a system. Then you take a very old historic thing, example, battle, and then you bring a slightly more recent historical example in, and then finally you end up with a current event example of it. And hopefully by that point they've reached a level which they can, if they've got emotional connections with the topic, they can take a step back and analyze it and think it through. That's the idea anyway. His books are good because they tend to give you both sides for this. Most works concentrate on just giving you one side's perspective, the hero's side or main character's side, and then they sort of skit over and don't really fully develop the other side. His books are good for that, are good for me to give the students because they fully develop both sides. So I can literally go, you can read this book and you can find out what both sides' strategic objectives are, what both sides' technology is reflective of each other, what both sides' thought processes are going on, what their tactical objectives are. And you can therefore put it together with all the information. And that's a useful thing. That is a useful thing for me. And the carriers, again, in this, they're the core. They are the core. There are other ships. And what's really interesting is how they use some of the older ships and how they get maneuvered around. But the carriers are very much the core. Oh, Farscape, the command carrier. Okay, can I just say this? In this series, probably one of the most powerful vessels put in is the command carrier. One of the worst designs of a ship I have ever seen. In that I don't think they actually thought through the realities of what they were supposed to be doing in these ships at all. They have these huge rings and then they have the guns mounted on them to maneuver around and all sorts of things. It's just, Why? Why are you designing your hull around a weapon system which is supposed to be secondary, especially as you are a command carrier? You are not just a carrier, you are a command ship specifically in your name. There is no way you should be anywhere near the scenario where you are having to directly engage. So building your hull around the concept of being able to directly engage goes against that, flies in the face of that. It really doesn't make sense. But that's what they do. That's what they've done. But still, okay, they have some good things there. They have some good things going on. They have some good capabilities. They are very large ships. They are definitely their own logistical hubs, etc. And that's another thing to think about with a carrier in terms of its operations. You are going to be taking all those facilities with you. Again, we talk about Parsite Craft, and sometimes people get too fixated on the concept of their, well, fighters are single-seat aircraft. Well, they didn't always used to be single-seat. In fact, quite a few of them are two-seat aircraft these days. And let's be honest, in space, with the complexity of space combat, if you've got, let's say, your Parsite Craft is designed to leave and return after a 10-day patrol, the odds are that's not going to be something which is going to be a single-seater, because you'll be sending someone off for 10 days on their own. And yes, maybe you do. Maybe you do, but then you'll be sending off a pair of them at least at a time to mutually support each other, and you would want to have the ability to rapidly move after them if they run into trouble, or to work out what's happened to them. You don't want to be in a scenario like the Germans were in World War II with their submarines, where they were basically waiting to see if they were late home from patrol to find out if anything happened to them. Because in a space warfare scenario, if you lose that ship on patrol, that might mean someone's coming for you. You don't want that to happen. There's also often the concept of people put forward that, in space you'll be able to see your opponent from a long, long way away. Doesn't necessarily work. Doesn't necessarily work. You'd hope to. You'd think you would. But there are going to be a lot of factors in that ability. A lot of factors. Again, another Glyn Stewart. There are books other than by Glyn, but I just put them in the beginning. Peacekeeper's Assault. Now, this is another good one which does have carriers in it. Carriers are very much the backbone. They are the backbone. They are the largest thing. But there again, they talk about Parsite Craft, i.e. their fighters. And they give an example. There's something in the books called the Red Wing campaign. I'm not going to explain in too much detail, but it's worthwhile reading. But basically, the backstory is the fighters sacrificed themselves. They ran into impossible odds and pretty much sacrificed themselves to allow the fleet to get away and fight another day. And there are very few survivors of that campaign. But basically, the Parsite Craft, the fighters, were fighting tremendous odds to try and get their fleet to get their fleet home, to get their fleet to safety, to protect the human colonies. And again, that's understandable, because losing a carrier, losing ships, that's going to be a lot of people lost. You want to take risks. If you want to take risks, it's going to be with small craft that you can afford to replace. You can easily replace. That you can produce in factory scenarios, rather than large craft, which are going to require something closer to a space sort of base shipyard to create. Something which is a factory line replacement is a far easier thing to lose. And you'd prefer not to lose that many pilots. But again, losing an entire ship crew, or many, many ships' crews, that can be far worse. So again, the Parsite Craft in this one, the carriers are the backbone. They're the big command ships. They're used for briefings, they're used as the centerpiece of fleets. But their role mainly is to stay back again, is to provide the fighter support. It's not to get into action themselves. When they do have to get into action, there's a problem going on. They prefer not to. That's what they actually have battle cruisers for, to get into action and do the job they need to do. Now, in Star Trek Starfleet Command, number 2, there is something called the Ranger class carrier. This is the USS Ark Royal. I love these. I love these for 2 reasons. One, it's the closest thing to showing me the reality of Starfleet. And 2, in the game, it's an absolutely wonderful ship. Far too many hours spent playing that game. It's a fun thing. I could do many things. I've used a fairly large group of them at certain points to do nasty things with them. And of course, the reality is, in Deep Space Nine, you saw a lot of fighters being used. There were a lot of small craft being used. And there are discussions of does Starfleet have carriers? Well, we know there were some Galaxy class, some books, etc. written as the Galaxy class were converted to carriers. There are Galaxy class which are turned into battle cruisers. There are Galaxy class which are, of course, they're exploration cruisers they're built. But, you know, you take out the exploration stuff, you take out the accommodation stuff where everyone has basically their own flat, their own wonderful space. I mean, I don't think we're moving into a multi sort of family dwelling for my family soon because it makes sense with my mum getting older and all the things going on. And so I'm going to have an annex in that accommodation, which is basically, it's called an annex, but it's got its own front door, its own downstairs, 2 bedrooms upstairs, that sort of thing. So it's actually quite a nice space. You know, it's about the same size as the houses I've been looking at personally for me to live in, because I don't need more space than that. I did a bit of a calculation on my space versus the apartment space in a Galaxy. I'd have more space in the Galaxy. I'm going to have 2 bedrooms. 2, both with ensuite wet rooms, you know, with showers and things that I can go in and wash and use the loo, those sort of spaces. I'm going to have a downstairs, which is supposedly a lounge and kitchen space, but it's actually going to be my office and kitchen space. And I'll still have less space than they had on the Galaxy. To say those things are empty is obscene. So converting them into a carrier is actually not that difficult. They also have huge hangar spaces already. So just, you know, expanding that out and building a sort of more off sections to store more aircraft and probably adding in even more accommodation spaces for all the... Well, actually, no. Will you need more accommodation spaces? Because you're getting rid of all the science personnel. You probably need more engineers. You'll need more pilots. So, you know, maybe you do something to the accommodation facilities as well. But, you know, the thing is, you've got the space for them. And it makes sense, especially for Starfleet to have carriers. A, they need vessels for disaster relief, and a vessel equipped with a huge number of Parsite Craft would certainly make sense for disaster relief and being able to facilitate the movement of people, etc. I know they use transporters, but there are certain scenarios where transporters are not advisable. There is a reason why there are 2 William Rikers walking around in the Star Trek universe. And there are other scenarios where, frankly, having that capability of deploying a lot of craft makes sense. If we consider the example of when, I think it was the Next Generation, when the Enterprise is leading several other ships in conducting what can basically be described as a blockade to try and prevent Romulan arms, well, the Tal Shiar, from supplying arms to a faction in the Klingon Civil War. Yes, I have watched too much Star Trek and science fiction in my time, but I enjoy it. It's a way to test my skills. And the reality is, that scenario, if they had one of their Galaxy carriers turn up with their 3-4 seat fighter scenarios, their little sort of aircraft, well, a little spacecraft, and deployed them, then they would have been able to make that blockade a lot thicker, a lot more dense and stronger, and have many, many more nodes on it. But B, they would have had in the asset of one ship would have had the capacity of expanding that many times over. Many, many times over. Sensor nets, data nets are again something I can see in the vastness of space as being useful. Being able to deploy multiple sensor anodes, sensor sort of, sensor collection positions are going to be a function. And yes, you might well be deploying drones. But again, you might want optionally crewed assets out there. You might want crewed assets. Because it's going to depend on how much decision making you want and where you want to deploy it to, and how much trust you have in subordinates to make that decision, carry out that decision making. It's going to be another factor. We have the Christopher Nuttall series, where carriers do all sorts of missions, honestly. Ark Royal is a lovely ship. The whole story is very, very well written by Christopher Nuttall. But, yeah, the carriers, some of the carriers in these books do missions which, frankly, I would never want a carrier to be doing, especially not solo. But, yeah, it's a good series, and it does give you another idea of what Parsite Craft might be useful for. What carriers, vessels with the ability to carry a majority, carry Parsite Craft for their act as their primary means of defense and offense, can get up to. The Shield Helicarrier. Now, I have to point out that my favourite version of the Shield Helicarrier, which I haven't managed to build yet, but I'm always hopeful of trying to get the model to build, was featured earlier. It's cool to look at. It's also cool to pick apart, because there are some things you just don't want to do. One of them is to land and be heading straight towards a massive fan, which is going to suck you in. You just don't want to do that. I always will remember the version where one of them was actually underwater, and I was going, hang on, are those fans deployed correct to the hull, or are they out wide underneath the hull? Because that could cause all sorts of issues with saltwater and saltwater corrosion. And that thing is going to be massive. I know, you're supposed to suspend belief a little bit, but I can't believe any sensible person, and this is why I believe the Shield Helicarrier might really be designed by a very different organisation. I think Hydra designed this, and they used the landing platform, or the landing system, as a way to take out pilots who they felt were loyal to Shield rather than Hydra. Because that is the only reason I can come up with for going, yes, we're going to land aircraft, and if they're having any difficulties, they are going to have to go straight into a fan. That's not good. That's not good. And then someone else was talking about, well, you know, they could land from the front going, well, that's going straight into your hangar. If they have problems, then they go straight into your hangar. Or if they veer off, they can go into your island structure or these fans. It's just, no. The helicarrier has some very good points, and when they're doing the evacuations, etc., they are wonderful for it. They are doing a wonderful job with the evacuations. But seriously, when they said Tony Stark had a look and put some ideas forward, I was really hopeful I was going to see some improvements. And then I was looking at going, so all he's done is fix the system, which keeps them airborne, makes them more efficient and more powerful. But also, as you can see here, these systems, but hasn't fixed the fact that the flight deck, the landing deck, takes you straight into one. Then we have Empire Rising by DJ Holmes. Now, carriers arrive late in this. Because honestly, they don't believe you can build small ships like fighters. You can, they believe there's a size limit you can get engines down to, so they can only go that size. So therefore, they're too big for a fighter aircraft or a smaller parasite craft. So they're all going to be big ships. And well, that's an interesting idea. But eventually they find a branch of humanity which has managed to crack that particular conundrum. And they go, oh, we can now build fighters. And they do have them from sort of certain points onwards. It's a good series. It does keep its internal logic mostly. I will say this. If you're arachnophobic, this series is a bit cathartic for you. If you have any arachnophobia at all, this series is definitely cathartic for you. Ah, the Wraith Hive ship. Now, the Wraith are a parasitic, in many ways, species. They need to suck the life of others, of other species, in order to live. They're kind of like the space-going version of ticks. So it's unsurprising that Parsite Craft, i.e. their sort of fighter systems, are a principal means of offence and defence of their largest vessels. In fact, all their vessels seem to carry them, which can, but their larger vessels, yes, they want to stay back. Yes, they have powerful weapons. Yes, they can heal themselves because they are living ships. They can also get sick because they are living ships. There are so many issues. They are incredibly inefficient because they are living ships. But they can heal themselves because they're living ships, and they can take a lot of damage because they are living ships in their density. But Parsite Craft make a lot of sense for them. They really do. They give them a chance of holding the enemy off. They also give them a chance of doing the culling and the things they need to do to harvest their food. It's also about bringing the hive into land. We were shown quite early on in the Stargate Atlantis series the difficulty of not just landing a hive, but also getting a hive airborne after it's been on this Earth for a long time. And because it's a living ship, it does seem to end up with things growing out of it when it sits on a planet. It's a better scenario all round if it deploys its forces as its parasite forces rather than tries to bring itself into action. Specifically because actually getting a replacement hive is very difficult. Very, very difficult. And yeah. Although they do, of course, get a super hive when they manage to basically make what you could call a cyber hive. Because they add in cybernetic systems. Principally, they add in power 0 point modules, which are the power systems of the ancients, the Atlanteans, etc., who had fought them in a war. If they use their power systems to boost the Wraith's efficiency, they fill out that center section. They become even more powerful and can carry even more darts, which are their primary parasite craft fighters. They can carry more of these assets, and it does make them far, far more powerful and far more heavily armed. But yeah, that is a bit of an extreme measure. And finally, we have Battlestar Galactica herself. So, if Venators are the most famous class of science fiction carriers, then honestly the most famous carrier is probably Battlestar Galactica. And the reason I draw the distinction is because I have actually met people who are ardent science fiction fans and yet still were not sure whether Battlestar Galactica was actually a class, whether all the Battlestars were individual ships, and when I tried to explain there's actually a couple of generations of different types of Battlestars, but basically Battlestar is a designation. Basically it's they don't have carriers. Although their primary offensive and defensive arm are their Vipers, are their their Parasite Craft, these ships, they also have significant defensive weapons themselves. They have their own cannon, which makes sense, honestly. Again, that's the discussion which often comes up is, well, if you're talking about its primary weapon being its Parasite Craft, well, if it has anything, then it's not a carrier. Well, no. You often have a layered defense. You'll have a layered task force defense, a layered task group defense, and a layered ship defense. A ship will not just depend on one layer to protect itself. And if you're a carrier, you're part of a task force, you're part of a task group, there are going to be lots of layers around you. And if you're a space-based carrier, well, A, the distances are going to be far bigger, and B, you're going to need to provide some of those layers yourself. You might be providing the outermost layer of your task force with your Parasite Craft. The outermost defensive and offensive layer. The layer which is going to keep the enemy as furthest away from you. That's great. But at some point, some of the layers through here back to you, you're going to probably provide some of them yourself. Or at least components of those layers yourself. Because it makes sense. Because otherwise you're too reliant. And it makes sense to have these things because you can't always rely on other craft to do the job. You can't always rely on even your fighters to do the job. Because let's say you get lulled into a full sense of security with your fighters, your Parasite Craft. Let's say you send them off to take out target A, and because you think that's going to be a main attack from the enemy, and they attack from another angle. And you have only a few Parasite Craft you can redirect in that direction. Well, that's going to make leakers more likely, especially until you manage to reorientate your primary group of Parasite Craft. In which case, you're going to need some defenses, probably. It doesn't stop those Parasite Craft being your primary method of defense and offense. It doesn't stop that, just because you have other systems. What matters is whether that is the balance, whether they are the primary methodology you have, and primary means you have offense and defense, i.e. they are not only your outer layer, they are your most important layer for that, or whether they are a secondary or additional layer in conjunction with your primary means, which are other weapon systems. Ship-based weapon systems. Whether they're missiles, torpedoes, guns in all the various forms you can get them, up to and including phasers. It doesn't matter. What matters is the balance. Anyway. The Battlestar Galactica, fairly good example of this. Yes, the best example, though, of her is the fact that you're able to upgrade her by giving different and newer fighters operator from her, which is something which I often explain about carriers. Carriers might go through multiple generations of aircraft operating from them. The important thing is to design them to be able to operate those multiple generations of aircraft. When you don't know what those future aircraft are going to look like, what does that mean? That means easily rearrangeable spaces. That means adding in margins to the lifts and the weight they can take, to the flight deck and the weight that can be landed on it. All those things. That is how you build future-proofing into a carrier. And also the other advantages for carriers, this is especially true on Earth, but it's probably true in space as well, there's going to be the ability to resupply them and rearm them. And the fact is, with Parasite Craft and hangar spaces, they're going to be more able to access resources to resupply them far more easily, because they're going to have the craft and the spaces which are set up to allow for them to access those materials, and therefore hopefully have access to materials to process it. Theoretically, spacecraft should, kind of like airships in the Age of Sail, carry the facilities to pretty much build anything they might need in space. Because, let's be honest, if you need a spare part, it's probably going to have a very long way to come. So it's going to probably be sensible to be able to produce that spare part yourself and have the resources to be able to do that. Anyway, so I always have a question at the end of my videos. And it's basically a little bonus for people if they actually manage to get the whole way through the video. There's a question. And I was thinking it through. And I think, if we go back, This is a pretty good definition for a carrier. But at which point, therefore, I thought, well, let's come up with definitions for battleships, battle cruisers, destroyers, frigates. I think it's worthwhile considering what the definitions of those vessels might be in terms of space, if you have them. And I do realise, again, there's probably going to be possibly even the same person who's going to start talking and going, oh, we're not going to have task groups and multiple different types of ships in space. And I refer you to my earlier points. A, it's going to fit with the human psychology of how you organise formations and fleets. And B, there are probably, even if you do go, and I remember reading one science fiction book which calls them Micmacs, which are modular ships. You're going to have possibly some modular ships which are orientated around Parsite Craft and their operation, and some modular some modular configurations which are going to be orientated around fighting versions in their various forms, and some which might be orientated around cruising roles. The presence mission, the escort mission, the exploratory missions, and even if that's the case, you're going to be using the same ship, you're just adding in modules and adapting it to those roles. You still are going to want to have some definitions of what you call that role and what you're looking for in that role, because it actually becomes even more important to have those definitions when you're using modular craft. Because those definitions that you are saying, right, for this role, we need this sort of ship, so we're going to select these modules. So the definitions become even more important because you've got that layer of selection. You've not just got the selection of the ship, you've got the selection of the modules. And modules give you all sorts of options. You go, oh, well, we could have this or this or this. And how many modules do we need? And what module, what kind of size vessel do we want to send out on this mission? Because again, if it's a modular ship, you can make it have a big, theoretically, you want it to be, by just adding in more modules. That's got to be a factor. So definitions become even more important to my mind the more modular you make your ships. So, I'd like to hear what your definitions might be for other things. Let's see. Let's go see what else we've got coming up. What have we got coming up? We have got coming up... I think it is... Yes, it's the conception, operation, and conclusion of HMS Ben Macherie, a World War I seaplane carrier. Because this month, in the year of the carrier, we've sort of reached World War I. If you look at it, we've sort of reached World War I. Then we're going to have April, which is going to be on the interwar years. May, which is going to be on some more of the interwar years, because it's on the treaty carriers, conception and conclusion of the Lexington class, conception and operation conclusion of the Chicago class, and then it's going to be starting on the war years in June. And July are going to be sort of World War II. And then post-World War II, Cold War era is going to be August, September, October, and a little bit of interesting stuff on November, including 2 historians, the Royal Navy that could have been, with a special guest, Drakenfell. Me and him talking about the aircraft carriers which could have been built. Gotta recall that early in the year, because that's going to be a good one. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Ba-da-da-da.